a blueprint for power, a plan shaping what comes next. Stay tuned as we break down Project 2026, who's behind it, what it proposes, and why its influence could redefine the future faster than you think. Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists that we have with us today. First, we have Dr. Wilmer Leon, nationally syndicated columnist and a regular contributor to national and international television news programs and newspapers. We have Dr. Nia Johnson, who's an assistant professor at Wake Forest Law School. We have Judith Hawkins, who's a former judge and attorney in Tallahassee, Florida. And we have Mr. Stephen Allred, who's the director of government relations for the Church State Council. Ladies and gentlemen, great having you here and looking forward to our show today. The priorities listed for Project 2026 build directly off of Project 2025, also known as the 2025 Presidential Transition Project launched by the Heritage Foundation to provide a ready-to-implement policy manual, vetted personnel list, and draft executive actions for the next Republican president. The project's central document, Mandate for Leadership, spanned over 900 pages and includes detailed plans to reorganize, reduce, or dismantle several federal agencies and programs. The overarching goal is to centralize presidential authority, eliminate perceived liberal influence from federal agencies, and implement widespread conservative changes across government, culture, energy, the economy, and healthcare. The Heritage Foundation 2025-2026 priorities really start talking about a number of things, including primarily the Chinese Communist Party. You know, when you take a look at what goes on, we went from Project 2025 to Project 2026. You know, one of the things I wasn't quite sure about is why do we have to connect a new set of priorities? But now it kind of seems like it's really just reiterating the policies from before in a way to make sure that we don't forget what we were focused on doing, and now putting in what I call the boogeyman, the Chinese Communist Party, as the central focus in a way to make sure that either you bring folk in, or maybe it's just the fact of the matter is we should be looking at this, but I'm not quite sure whether or not it's a little bit too much, or is it right on time, or maybe it's just more political propaganda.
It's political propaganda, but it's very, very dangerous political propaganda. First of all, people need to understand what the Heritage Foundation is. It's a conservative think tank that was founded, I want to say around 1974, by Paul Weyrich, Edwin Fuellner, and Joseph Coors. So first, people need to look up those three folks to get an idea of what their ideologies are based on: libertarian economics, Christian evangelical nationalism, eugenics, white supremacist segregationist policy, gender anxiety, and a whole lot of other things. And the focus of 2026 is really this report, Saving America by Saving the Family, which is very lofty rhetoric, but you have to then ask yourself, how do you get there? And that's the real dangerous element of this. It's not the lofty rhetoric that they discuss, it's the methods and the mechanisms which they attempt to employ, such as cutting Medicaid, cutting access to child care, cutting workforce and harassment. And they're trying to do this on the backs of limiting the rights of women. That's what's really dangerous about what they're proposing here.
I was just
And
going
I,
to jump in and say that I think that, you're absolutely right. And I think part of what's also worth acknowledging here is also like, this positioning as being an anti-Chinese government, right? And, the US has had fraught relationships with China for a long time. This isn't necessarily new, but I also think it's worth understanding how China plays in the global landscape and how this could actually backfire on the Republican Party if they decide that they want to stand on this. China has also spent some of their resources investing in countries that feel frustrated by Western agendas and feel frustrated by American governments. I mean, we've seen this happen in a micro scale, not necessarily with China, but with other countries when we talk about things like terrorist cells in parts of the Caribbean that have been stoked by, like extremists in the Middle East, right? So China has, expanded their influence in the Caribbean by donating for projects that the people there need, such as roads and other things. And these are also the same people being excluded by American immigration policy at the same time, right? So it seems like this is also the perfect storm for some other types of frustrations in the global landscape. And I don't know if the Republican Party wants to be known as the party who stoked these dynamics, especially when they could actually have a really nice opportunity here to actually just give people what they need, right? There have been recent news coverage of veterans losing their homes and opportunities to buy homes because Veterans Affairs grants for homes have been cut, right? Like, and veterans have been a large base of the Republican Party, right? So, I think it's important, absolutely, like in knowing who the Heritage Foundation is, we should, right? Because it does inform their ideology and trajectory. But I also think it's worth knowing that, and the Republican Party should know that they don't have to be synonymous with the Heritage Foundation, right? Like they don't have to have the final say on what Republican policy is or is not, because there are a ton of reasons why the way that the Heritage Foundation is positioning themselves is unwise from a policy standpoint and may actually create a more animosity and isolationism that is unnecessary.
I think, as it relates to China, I'm chuckling because is this the pot calling the kettle black? All the things that they're accusing China of doing, to me, America is quite skilled and seasoned in doing the same things. And it also makes me think of that illustration of how do you get yeast out of bread that's rising? So, my other comment is I've got tongue in cheek today on this panel. First observation is that the work product of the Heritage Foundation is so involved, extensive, and detailed that only those with both the time and the interest can work through it. And that in itself is a red flag. There's a 14-page summary of the document, 14-page summary of the document itself. And I agree with the first two panelists, and particularly with Professor Johnson there. The Heritage Foundation is pushing America with its very right-wing, restrictive, conservative ideology into a position that most likely is going to backfire because China's got power and resources, and it's as she says, they're ingratiating themselves to the population that America Heritage Foundation is shutting down and shutting out. Just saying.
Well, Steve, we're kind of looking at these instances where, you have the United States, that's a superpower. We have China, it's a superpower. Superpowers have certain characteristics, and they all look the same. And that's why when you kind of look at something, you start saying, that kind of resembles me. Maybe there are parts of this I really don't want to see happening, but it seems like Project 2026 was really just kind of lighting the flare again. Don't forget about 2025 and let's make this the point of emphasis. Or is it, and this is what I like to tell people, win an election. To the victor goes the spoils. If you don't like this, go out and vote. But when you win, you get to do what you want to do. And that seems to be American politics. What's the big deal?
Yeah, I mean, we know that I think one estimate is that the Trump administration has implemented about 50% of Project 2025, right? So, clearly not all of it has been accomplished yet. And so the Heritage Foundation is putting out some things here as I'm looking at Project 2026 that are reiterations of what they've already laid out there with some additional stuff. What hits me about what you were saying there, Orlin, is, to the victor goes the spoils. Here's the thing, that applies to both sides. And I think it's interesting to see, for example, their priority of rooting out the deep state. And it's like, well, the bureaucracy, the governmental bureaucracy is supposed to be apolitical, right? It's supposed to work with both sides of the aisle and be a more stable part of our government. And yet it seems like we're politicizing even that, right? We're going to now be able to hire and fire who we want. Well, we need to keep in mind that applies to both sides. And so if somebody else gets in power in the federal administration next time around, the other side isn't going to like that. So I think that, we have had a pretty good system in this country. I know there's been the perception that there are some of these huge problems like with election fraud and whatever, but even the Heritage Foundation's own website doesn't bear that out. I mean, you look at their website that deals with election fraud, and there are very few cases of it, and most of them are very old cases going back a long time. And so I feel like some of these are solutions looking for a problem, and they are good because they get people riled up and they get them perhaps to vote for what people want. But is this helping our country long term? Is it really making us a stronger, more cohesive country? Some of it, I would say, absolutely not.
I think that Stephen is absolutely right, especially on this point of what is applied to one side also applies to the other. I think what's really interesting about, theories like the unitary executive theory, right, which is essentially what Donald Trump is trying to play out, that because he is the president, he has the final say. And if, administrative state is not willing to play that out, then they are disrupting his authority. But what's troubling about this is that, this balance and neutrality also benefits the other side as well. And it's going to be very interesting seeing folks experience the ramifications of the quote unquote deep state on the other side, right? Like there's a reason why, these parameters are here. So the unitary executive theory, it doesn't just apply to one person, it applies to other folks too. And that can also create its own ramifications.
To Stephen's point, I want to say the voter fraud statistic is 0.00007. That's the percentage of voter fraud cases in this country. I'm glad you made mention of the boogeyman, because that's what a hegemon needs in order to manufacture consent and to create a consensus that we have an enemy that we have to fight. The Chinese Communist Party didn't force the American industrial complex to deindustrialize. That wasn't they didn't hold a gun to anybody's head. And China is a sovereign nation, which means that they are able to implement the policies and economic policies within their own country the way they see fit. They just now seem to be doing it better than us.
And they seem to be doing it here in America with quite ease, which is another thing that I find kind of amusing. So I think America should be concerned about China, but it's doing the same thing in China. Like I said, 6 on one hand, half a dozen on the other.
Well, I think you brought up the right point there, Judge, that we have to understand that in politics, sometimes the winner does get to do what it wants to do, but you should do it in a way where you understand that you may not win all the time. So if the other side decides to put themselves in a position, you're hoping that there's going to be somewhat of a balanced approach. But the biggest issue that I've seen, I've worked for Republicans and I've worked for Democrats, and the fact of the matter is the most important thing I've always noticed, how do I get elected? And once I get elected, then I'll figure out what I'm going to do for the people. Coming up, an employee given a religious exemption for a vaccine mandate is told it will be reversed unless she can prove sincerity. Stick around, we'll be right back. When faith and government collide, the issues can be complex and consequential. Faith in Politics explores how religious conviction intersects with law, policy, and public life, offering depth, balance, and clarity with meaningful discussion and trusted insight. To see a bunch of our previous episodes, check us out at faithandpolitics.tv and subscribe to us on YouTube. There's a case that's called Weiss versus the Permanente Medical Group. And after about 2 decades of working as a senior consultant and department manager for Kaiser Permanente, Minnie Weiss was fired for following her faith. When the healthcare giant imposed a COVID-19 vaccine mandate on employees, Weiss requested a religious exemption, explaining that her faith does not allow her to receive the vaccine. At the time, she was fully remote worker, and her team remains fully remote to this day. And after originally approving her religious exemption, Kaiser reversed course and demanded that she complete an additional checklist to prove her sincerity. When she declined to answer intrusive questions about her medical history, Kaiser revoked her exemption and fired her. Judge Hawkins, this seems to me to be one of the issues that we have to start grappling with on a regular basis. When does somebody get to ask somebody else, how sincere are you from a religious standpoint? Judge, please help me with this.
So let me ask you this. To commit the act of shoplifting, you just have to pass beyond the last place you can actually pay for the item. So as I look at this case, I'm thinking to myself, nobody asked the person why they stole the bread or what their motives were for taking switching the shoes in the shoebox. All the court should want to know is, did you pass the last place that you could pay for the item? So it seems to me that when you move from the objective to the subjective, it gets kind of murky. Okay? She said that her religious objection was based on her faith, and that's what she said. Sounds to me like that's what she said. Now, if there's some objective data, I'll give you a good example. If you say that you're a Sabbath keeper, but you've been seen, I love it. Better example are the workers' comp cases. You say you have a workers' comp injury that prevents you from working, and so you should receive benefits. However, they send out the private detector or whatever, and they catch you doing the exact same things that you say you can't do. And we can work with that, but that's her objective. That's all I got to say.
Well, Stephen, this is what paints the issue here. I mean, you're probably uniquely qualified. You're a pastor who became an attorney, so you kind of gone through different walks of life from what I would call, leaning from maybe even an emotional and spiritual into these group of crazy people they call lawyers that want to know the facts and the facts only, right? But the reality is what's scary here is somebody gets to tell me or you whether we're sincere enough in our religion. And the bigger issue is maybe yesterday I wasn't so sincere, but today I am. Who gets to make that call? Am I just creating more chaos by even going down this road?
Yeah, and first off, this case was handled at the trial court level by my colleagues Alan Reinach and Jonathan Cherney here at the Church State Council. So this is one of our cases. I wasn't on board with them when they took this case, so I've heard a bit about it from kind of their perspective. And the second thing is I am sympathetic to Kaiser Permanente and the other healthcare organizations, because if you look back to that time, I mean, come on, we're in the middle of a pandemic. The hospitals and employers everywhere are trying to figure out how do we protect people. The government's telling us we need to, encouraging vaccination. And so everyone's doing the best they can, number one. Number two, there were a lot of folks who suddenly found religion during the pandemic because they realized that was their off-ramp from getting a vaccine that they were scared of getting for scientific reasons. It wasn't a religious reason to begin with. It was a scientific, they doubted the science or whatever. I'm sympathetic to those people, but I'm also sympathetic to the employer who says, we're a little skeptical here because we got a lot of people suddenly who we had no clue they had any religion, and now they're telling us they're religious. And so in this case, here's the thing. I mean, it is a slippery slope, though. And I think this is why I know Alan Reinach, my colleague, and the president of the Church State Council got involved with these types of cases really was to say, hey, listen, if the courts start questioning the sincerity issue, where do we go from there? Yeah. And it becomes a very big mess. And so that he said, we got to get in there and help these folks because of that. In this case, here's the gal. She's working remotely. She's not going to infect anybody. It seems like this would be a pretty easy one for Kaiser to say, you know what, let's just let it go. For some reason, they fought it. And, I think the courts here, we'll see I think it's still at the Ninth Circuit pending there, from what I understand. So we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, I would love to jump in here because I think there's a couple of like different competing interests here. Like even just putting like the law to the side, right? And thinking about, okay, when do we start evaluating how, faithful people really are, which is something that the courts have like tussled with for a long time. So this is not necessarily new. But one thing I do want to add, and I feel like I bring this up quite a bit when I'm on this show, is that I think some of this is also a reflection of how people perceive religious people, and whether, like if you believe in the theological concept of being a good neighbor, right? Like, what does that really look like? And I find that many of these cases also demonstrate I don't know if I would say angst, but I would dare say the annoyance at religious folks more broadly and how they are perceived in the culture, right? And I can totally, I wouldn't say understand or condone, but I can see how you have, kind of like Stephen said, you have a company that's trying to do the best they can, right? Like, we're not necessarily here even talking about, obviously the individual was a remote worker, but we're not talking about the dynamic of what if you go to work with somebody who at the time was unvaccinated and then you get COVID, right? Like, like we're not having those type of neighborly conversations, right? We're talking about, church and state separation in place of that, right? And so you can see how a company could, I think this is something that Christian folks have seen specifically and ignored, consider you to be a burdensome employee, right? And consider you to be somebody who is not necessarily, thinking of other people. And I don't think that that's necessarily right, but I do think it kind of, it speaks to the culture and how folks perceive certain religious groups. And I think it's also like, worth thinking about, okay, how do we move through the world, right? Like, where do we sit our theology next to being, I guess like if we're taking like a biblical, take of like, in the world, but not of the world. Like you still have to exist, right? And I think that sometimes these cases reflect a public sentiment where folks feel like, you may be a little bit more of a burden than we would appreciate you being. And therefore, we're going to try to tussle with that in the courts. And that leads us to questions that we shouldn't really be asking in a legal context, but that's the powers that people have.
I have to, first of all, acknowledge that I am a Kaiser baby. I was born in a Kaiser hospital. So I need to make that. On the COVID-19 vaccine issue, I understand the hospital's position. We're talking public health here. And this makes me think about the measles issue in the Mennonite community in Texas and their refusal to get the measles vaccine. And now we see an outbreak of a disease that had been eradicated in the United States. So on the requirement, I understand that because I think the importance of public health outweighs in many instances your personal religious belief or perspective. But they took the bit too far with this loyalty oath or this loyalty test that they, and a very subjective one at that. I would have thought the Kaiser attorneys would have been much, much smarter than this.
Yeah.
And especially to allow it to get to the degree that it has come to. There's no way in the world that that you can subject employees to loyalty oaths when it comes to their religious belief and affiliation. What is the scale?
Yeah.
How do you determine this? What are they going to do? Send this to the Pope and ask the Pope to? I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Isn't there a push now for loyalty tests within the administration? I mean, I'm just throwing this out here. It's, but I really like your phrase earlier, which is be so religious yesterday, but last night I had a conversion experience, and so now I see things differently. And wait, and don't forget this. I don't think we can have an intelligent dispute that measles and chickenpox and all of those childhood diseases for which immunizations were given and apparently worked for years, decades, teen vaccination. I don't think we should just throw that in that same pot. Just saying.
Well, Kaiser seems to be taking on this kind of what I would call it almost like a mob feel. I mean, it's like famous words from mob movies. We're trying to run a business here, right? And so they seem to be taking on this mode of, we don't really care what's going on with you. We're trying to run a healthcare business here. And anybody that comes in and gets in the way of it, we think the value of the business is so important that if you end up running over folk along the way, it's not a big deal.
I mean, it's a really interesting, framing. I mean, especially when we're in the moment where people are querying, like, whether Citizens United should be overturned, right? Like this, like, elevation of the corporation, like shareholder primacy, a number of different things, right, are all kind of flushing together at this moment. We are trying to decide, okay, the U.S. has a very intense interest in business in the free market. The U.S. also has a very intense interest right now in religious freedom, right? So what happens when you push those two things together? And I do think that it can be tricky. And that's why I said, this may be a situation where people are trying to fight cultural wars in the courts. And if some religious institutions had the wherewithal and, dare I say, the restraint, right, to mitigate some of this from a social standpoint, then we probably wouldn't have to tussle about this in the courts. But one other thing I want to note, since we're talking about measles very quickly, is that the folks in Western Texas who did not give their children the measles vaccine, they actually said, even though their children, the two parents of the children who died said that they were comfortable with it because they left it to God's will, right? And so I do think that, even that becomes complex, and we put that on the table because we do give parents and religious folks those types of freedoms. And, we'll just have to see what happens with the next generation of children that impacts.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word, Nia, but I think what we're really looking at is how do we start to differentiate between who should really be in charge? Do you give the power to a parent? Do you give the power to a healthcare organization? Do you give the power to a government? Well, the fact of the matter is the power is really supposed to be with the people. Judge Hawkins, tell me something I don't know.
Did you know that the Mars Odyssey is still in circulation 24 years after it was launched into orbit, and it continues to provide information for 6 more Mars missions?
Wilmer, tell me something I don't know.
Did you know that water might not be wet? And that this is because most scientists define wetness as a liquid's ability to maintain contact with a solid surface, meaning that water itself is not wet, but can make other objects wet.
Nia, tell me something I don't know.
So did you know that for about a third of Americans, that healthcare is about to be a big issue in the 2026 election?
Kind of feeling that. Steve, tell me something I don't know.
We talked about COVID, and I heard something about measles here today. Did you know, Orland, that smallpox, at least according to the sources I'm reading, is the only infectious disease that affects humans to have been completely eradicated? Back in 1977, the last case appeared, and in 1980, the World Health Organization declared it eradicated.
Wow, I appreciate all the information today. Really enjoyed our talk. And thank you again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time. Are you all caught up on faith and politics, but still looking for more content? I've got a great recommendation for you. Liberty Magazine. It's got in-depth, timely articles on hot-button issues of church and state. Check it out and subscribe today.